Let's move, boy. This is the one. No arguments.
Looks strong enough.
There is a moment in life when silence says more than any word ever could. When a crowd of people who are just laughing suddenly go completely still, not from boredom, not from distraction, but because something happens right in front of their eyes that reaches into their chest and squeezes. This is one of those moments. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon in Harlan County, Colorado, at a livestock auction yard that smelled of sawdust and cigarette smoke, and something older and sadder that nobody ever named. Most people who were there that day still don't talk about what they witnessed, not because it was forgettable, but because some things you see change the way you look at everything else after. This is the story of a pony named Dust, and of the day an entire town was forced to reckon with what it had been willing to ignore for years. Nobody expected anything unusual to happen that afternoon. The Harlan County Livestock Sale happened every third Tuesday of the month, the same way it had happened for 40 years, and the people who came were mostly ranchers, farmers, a few weekend hobbyists, and a handful of teenagers who had nothing better to do than lean against the wooden fence rails and eat corn chips from a bag. The sun was already sliding low when the old rancher named Cleet Alderman walked into the side yard, pulling something behind him on a rope. It was a pony, small, dark brown, with a coat that had gone dull and patchy the way a coat goes when an animal has not been brushed in many months. The pony's legs were shaking. Not violently, just that quiet, persistent trembling that comes from muscles that have been asked to carry weight they no longer have the strength for. The pony was maybe 14 years old, maybe older. Its back was sunken slightly in the middle. Its ribs showed along its left side, like the ridges on a washboard. One of its ears had a notch cut into it, old and healed over, from something that had happened long ago. Cleet Alderman was 63 years old and had worked land in that county for most of his adult life. He was a thick man with a red face and hands so calloused they looked like leather gloves he never took off. He wore a green canvas jacket that had seen better decades and a hat pulled low over eyes that did not particularly look at anything directly. He dragged the pony across the gravel lot toward the holding pen, and the pony's hooves scraped and scrambled trying to find grip on the wet gravel, and Cleet yanked the rope each time the pony slowed, hard enough to snap the animal's head sideways. It had rained that morning. The ground near the back holding area was a mess of dark mud and standing water that reflected the gray sky overhead. Cleet did not go around it. He walked straight through it, rope in hand, and the pony had no choice but to follow, and its legs sank into the mud up past the ankle, and it lurched and struggled and made a low, strained sound that was not quite a whinny. It was quieter than that, more private, the kind of sound an animal makes when it is frightened and does not know how to say so. Someone in the small crowd near the fence laughed. It was a short laugh, the kind that comes out when something looks clumsy, when an animal stumbles and looks foolish. Then someone else laughed. A teenager near the gate said something to his friend, and they both grinned. An older man in a blue jacket shook his head, but was smiling too, the way people smile when they think they are watching something that doesn't really matter. The pony went down on one knee in the mud. It happened fast and slow at the same time. The front left leg buckled first, and the pony lurched forward, and for a second it looked like it might recover, but the mud was deep, and the leg had no strength left to push back up, and the pony went all the way down to both front knees, head low, neck stretched out, just trying to stay above the ground. Its eyes were open wide, dark brown, wet at the edges. Its sides were heaving. Cleet yanked the rope. The pony's head jerked up, and its legs scrambled, and it made that sound again, that small, private sound, and the mud sucked at its legs, and it could not get up, and Cleet yanked again, harder this time, and the crowd laughed louder now. Some of them, the ones who thought this was just a stubborn old horse being dramatic. A woman standing near the water trough at the far end of the yard went very still. Her name was Nora Vasquez. She was 37 years old, wore her dark hair pulled back, and had driven 40 minutes that morning from the wildlife rescue operation. She ran out of a converted barn on the edge of town. She had come to the sale looking to buy hay supplies, not horses. She had not planned to get involved in anything. She was holding a paper coffee cup, and she stopped lifting it to her mouth, and she just watched, and her face went through something that was not easy to describe, not just anger, not just sadness, but the kind of expression that comes over a person's face when they recognize something they have been trying not to see for a long time. The crowd kept laughing. The pony stayed down on its knees in the mud, shaking, its breath coming in short visible clouds in the cold afternoon air, its eyes looking at nothing and everything at once. Cleet Alderman raised the rope to yank again. And that was the moment Nora Vasquez put her coffee cup down on the top rail of the fence, very quietly, and walked forward. The mud was cold and thick, and it pulled at Nora's boots with each step she took toward the pony. She did not run. She walked with the kind of steadiness that comes not from calm, but from a decision so final there is no room left for hesitation. The laughing near the fence died down slowly, the way a radio signal fades when you drive out of range, not all at once, but in patches, until the only sound left was the low wind moving through the bare cottonwood trees along the lot's east edge and the wet sound of Nora's boots in the mud. Cleet Alderman saw her coming, and his face did something complicated. He was not a man who was used to being approached. Not by women. Not in the middle of what he considered his business. His jaw tightened, and he stood a little straighter, and his grip on the rope did not loosen. Nora did not look at Cleet. She went straight to the pony. She crouched down in the mud beside the animal, without hesitating, without worrying about her jeans or her jacket, and she put one hand flat against the pony's neck, not grabbing, just pressing, the way you press a hand against a wall to check if it's warm or cold. The pony flinched at the touch, a full-body flinch, every muscle jumping at once. And then, when nothing hurt, when no blow came, it went very still under her hand. The pony's name, she would find out later, was Dust, not a glamorous name. Not the kind of name you give an animal you think much of. A kind of name you give something you don't plan to keep. Up close, the pony was worse than it had looked from the fence. The patchy coat was not just from lack of brushing. There were places along its back where the hair had grown back differently, in shorter, rougher patches, over old scar tissue. Along the inside of the right rear leg, there was a wound that was not quite healed, more of a rawness, a place where something had rubbed long enough and hard enough to break the skin. The pony's hooves had not been trimmed in so long that they had begun to curl upward at the front edges, growing at angles that changed how the animal stood and walked and put its weight down on the earth. This was not a horse that had been injured once. This was a horse that had been living inside a long, quiet, accumulating damage that most people around it had chosen not to look at. Nora slid her other hand under the pony's chest and applied slow, steady upward pressure. Not forcing, guiding. She made a sound low in her throat, a kind of steady, rhythmic murmur, and she kept her hand against its neck, and the pony began to figure out what was being asked of it, and its legs found something in the mud to push against, and it came up slowly, unevenly, one leg at a time, until it was standing. It stood shaking against her shoulder. Cleet Alderman said, "That's my animal." His voice was flat, not angry yet. The voice of a man who is deciding how angry to be. Nora finally looked at him. She looked at him the way a person looks at an equation they have already solved. She did not raise her voice. She said, "How much do you want for it?" It was not a question the way she said it. It was something else. Cleet's eyes narrowed. He looked at the pony, looked at the woman with mud on her knees, looked at the small crowd that had stopped laughing and was now watching with a different kind of attention. The attention people pay when something real is happening and they know it. He said a number. It was a high number. Too high for an animal in this condition. Too high by the logic of the market. Too high in a way that communicated that this was not really about selling. Nora reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a folded envelope. She counted out the bills without looking away from him. Cleet Alderman took the money. His hands were not as steady as his voice. Nora unclipped her own leg rope from the belt loop where she always carried one and snapped it onto the pony's halter, and she walked the animal slowly, one patient step at a time, out of the mud and toward the road where her trailer was parked. The pony followed her. It did not look back. The crowd at the fence did not make a sound. One of the teenagers had taken out his phone. He had been filming for the last 4 minutes without realizing he had started doing it. The video went up that evening. The teenager, his name was Marcus, 17 years old, worked weekends at his uncle's equipment repair shop, had not meant to post it publicly. He posted it to his small account as something he had seen that day, the way people post things they cannot quite shake, and by the next morning it had been shared 1,100 times, and by noon it had reached people in 4 states. The video was not dramatic in the way that viral videos usually are. There was no music. There was no confrontation that ended in shouting. There was just the image of a small brown pony down on its knees in the mud, and a woman walking toward it, and a crowd going quiet, and then the pony standing back up. 37 seconds. The comments filled in what the video did not say. People who knew Cleet Alderman began to recognize the animal. Someone in the comments section wrote that they had driven past the Alderman property on Route 9 many times and had seen that pony standing alone in a dry lot with no shade covering. Someone else wrote that they had stopped once and offered to buy hay for the field because the grass had gone to nothing in the summer drought, and they had seen the pony's ribs from the road. Cleet had told them to keep moving. Another person wrote that they had reported their concerns to the county animal welfare office 8 months earlier and had never received any follow-up response. That detail landed hard. The animal welfare office for Harlan County at that time operated on a part-time staff of 2 people, covering a territory that included 14 working ranches, 3 small farms, and hundreds of private property parcels. They received complaints by paper form that were logged into a system that had last been updated in 2009. The complaint, filed 8 months earlier, had been logged. It had not been investigated. Not because the officers were cruel people. They were not, but because there was too much land and not enough hours, and the funding that had once supported a 3rd staff position had been cut 4 budget cycles ago. None of this was a secret. All of it had been allowed to continue because it was easier to allow things to continue than to push against them. Nora Vasquez learned most of this while she sat in her truck in the parking lot of a gas station 12 miles from the auction yard, feeding the pony electrolyte-laced water through the trailer window with a turkey baster because it was too weak to drink normally. Her phone was buzzing steadily on the seat beside her. She did not look at it for a long time. She was thinking about the scar tissue on the pony's back. Old scars? Yes, but she had worked with horses long enough to read their histories in their bodies the way other people read text on a page. Those scars were from repeated contact with something. A poorly fitted harness or a saddle that had been used long past its condition. There were pressure calluses on the pony's withers that told her the animal had been worked under weight even after those injuries formed. Not worked hard. Just worked past the point where working was something the animal could manage without cost. 14 years of small, steady, unremarked-upon cost. She finally picked up her phone. She called Dr. Emmett Reyes, the large animal veterinarian she worked with regularly, and she told him what she had and what she needed. He said he could be at her facility by 7 that evening. She called the woman who ran the state's equine welfare reporting network and told her what she knew about the animal welfare office backlog. And that woman said she had been trying to get someone to pay attention to that situation for 3 years, and maybe now they would. She called her assistant at the rescue barn and told him to prepare the isolation stall, extra bedding, and to have the soaking tub ready for the hooves. Then she put the truck in drive and pulled carefully back onto the highway and drove toward home. In the trailer behind her, Dust stood quietly in the late afternoon light coming through the slats, and for the first time in longer than anyone knew, the animal was not being pulled anywhere. It was just moving forward before she came to Cleet, Alderman's property, which had happened 7 years prior through a private sale at a feed store parking lot. $200 cash, no paperwork. The pony had been called Penny. She had been born on a small breeding operation in Wyoming run by a woman named Joelle Hartman, who had raised Morgan mixed ponies for 30 years and who had a reputation among people who cared about such things for producing horses with exceptionally steady temperaments. Joelle had bred and sold more than 60 horses in her career and had kept careful records of every one of them. Photographs, health logs, training notes, the names of the families who took them. Penny had been born in early April during a cold snap that had dropped the temperature back to winter levels overnight. She had been small even by pony standards, and she had been the kind of foal that wanted human contact from the first days of her life, the kind that would press its nose against your jacket and stay there, not asking for anything, just present. Joelle had spent extra time with her that spring because she recognized something in the animal that she had learned over decades to pay attention to, a quality of attention, a quality of willingness. Some horses perform, some horses endure. This one connected. She had sold Penny at age 7 to a family in northern Colorado, 2 parents, and a girl named Sadie, who was 9 years old and learning to ride. The arrangement had worked well for 2 years. Penny had carried Sadie through her first canter, her first trail ride, the first time she went over a low jump and came down laughing. The family had sent Joelle a photograph at Christmas that first year, Sadie with her arms around the pony's neck, both of them squinting into the sun. Then the family had moved. The father had taken a job transfer. The house was sold. The logistics of moving a pony across state lines into temporary housing while they found a permanent place had become too complicated too fast, and someone at the stables where Penny was boarded had mentioned a man who would take her quickly and keep her on working land, and the family had said yes because they were out of time and out of options, and they told themselves it was a good solution. They did not investigate Cleet Alderman. They did not ask to see his property. They signed over the papers in a parking lot and drove away, and Sadie cried for most of the drive home, and her parents told her that Penny would be well cared for, and they believed it because they needed to believe it. Cleet Alderman had bought the pony with the intention of using her for light ranch work, moving small groups of cattle through areas where ATVs couldn't navigate easily, carrying feed bags through gated pasture sections. He was not a man who considered himself cruel. He considered himself practical. He did not think much about whether an animal was comfortable. He thought about whether an animal was useful. For the first year, Penny, who he renamed Dust because he said the old name was foolish, had been useful enough. But working horses age differently depending on how they are kept. An animal with good feed, adequate rest, regular hoof care, and dental maintenance can work well into its late teens. An animal that receives the minimum, the amount of care that keeps it alive and functional, but no more, ages faster, wears down in ways that are not traumatic enough to notice from 1 month to the next, but are devastating across years. By the time Dust was 11, she could no longer move cattle efficiently because her joints ached in the cold mornings, and she was slower to start. Cleet did not take her to a vet. He reduced her workload and reduced her feed at the same ratio, which was the practical math of a man who measured everything in output. When the hoof walls began to grow deformed, he did not call the farrier because the farrier cost money and the pony was no longer earning it back. When the wound appeared on her rear leg from a broken fence rail she had been leaning against for warmth on cold nights, he watched it and decided it was not bad enough to treat. By the time he dragged her into the mud at the Harlan County livestock sale, he had already decided she was worth nothing. He had brought her there not to sell her seriously, but to see if anyone would take her off his hands for enough to cover his gas money for the drive. When no buyer had appeared in the first hour, he had pulled her toward the back, holding pen the way you carry a bag of garbage toward a bin, with the casual contempt of someone disposing of something they should have dealt with much sooner. He had not expected anyone to step in. He had not expected anyone to be watching that closely. He had not expected that a 17-year-old boy would have his phone out at exactly the right moment. In the weeks that followed, the state equine welfare investigators came to the Alderman property. What they found there, not just regarding Dust, but regarding the general condition of the land and the other animals on it, resulted in a formal proceeding that took 4 months to conclude. Cleet Alderman was barred from owning livestock in the state of Colorado for 7 years. The backlog at the Harlan County Animal Welfare Office became the subject of a local news investigation that ran for 3 consecutive weeks and resulted in 2 additional staff positions being funded by the county board the following budget cycle. Joelle Hartman, the woman who had bred Penny in Wyoming, found out what had happened through the video that Marcus had posted. She sat at her kitchen table for a long time looking at the 37 seconds of footage. Then she found Nora Vasquez's rescue operation online, and she drove down the following weekend with a bag of the specific feed supplements she had developed over 30 years for horses with Penny's body type. She walked into the barn and she stood at the stall door and she looked at the pony that had once pressed its nose into her jacket and stayed there. The pony looked back at her. Spring came late that year to Harlan County. The cottonwoods did not start to bud until the 2nd week of April, and the mornings were still cold enough to see her breath well into May. But in the paddock behind Nora Vasquez's rescue barn, things were changing in ways that did not need warm weather to begin. Dust had been at the facility for 4 months by the time the first green showed in the field. Her hooves had been trimmed and reset twice by then, a process that took weeks because you cannot correct years of overgrowth all at once without creating new pain. So it had to be done gradually, incrementally, in small adjustments that let the hoof wall and the coffin bone realign at a pace the animal could handle. The wound on her rear leg had closed fully by the end of the first month. Dr. Emmett Reyes had come out 8 times in total, more than was technically required, because he said he wanted to see the full arc of the recovery, and Nora knew that was true, but also knew that he simply wanted to watch. The coat came back slowly. First the dullness left. Then the patchiness began to fill in as the nutrition reached the follicles, and the body redirected resources it had been forced for years to put elsewhere. By March, the dark brown had deepened to something closer to mahogany in the winter light, and the patches over the old scar tissue were still visible if you looked closely, but they were no longer the first thing you saw. What you saw first, by March, was how Dust moved. It was nothing dramatic. She did not run across the field in the way that healthy horses sometimes do. That explosive burst of motion that looks like joy distilled into speed. She did not show off. She walked. She walked with a steadiness and a deliberateness that Nora had watched shift month by month from the careful, placing movement of an animal, compensating for pain, to something that was simply present. The walk of an animal that is not bracing for anything. Nora was careful about visitors during those months. She kept the recovery quiet, kept Dust away from the attention that the video had generated, because attention is not the same thing as care. And she had learned over her years of doing this work that animals healing from long-term neglect do not need to be exhibits. They need consistency. They need to know what happens next. They need the food to come at the same time, each day, and the human at the gate to be the same human, and the hands that touch them to be hands that do not suddenly change their mind. Sadie found them in March. She was 19 now. She had spent the intervening years thinking about the pony she had been told was fine, knowing somewhere under that thought that the certainty was borrowed and not earned. When the video circulated, a friend of hers from her old neighborhood in Colorado had sent it to her with a message that said, "Isn't this the horse your family had?" Sadie had watched the 37 seconds 9 times in a row, sitting on the floor of her college dorm room, with her back against the bed and her knees pulled up to her chest. She had contacted Nora through the rescue's website. She had not asked for anything. She had just written what she knew and what she was sorry for, and that she understood if there was nothing appropriate for her to do. Nora had written back and told her to come on a Saturday in March. She brought the photograph, the one from Christmas, 10 years before. Sadie and Penny squinting into the sun. She stood at the paddock fence, and she did not call out or make sounds. She just stood there, the way Nora had told her to, patient and quiet. And after a few minutes, the pony that was now named Dust lifted her head from the grass at the far end of the paddock and looked in her direction. And then, without rushing, the pony walked across the field toward the fence. She stopped a few feet away, and she looked at the young woman for a long moment with those dark brown eyes. Then she pressed her nose against Sadie's jacket and stayed there. Sadie put her hand on the pony's neck and did not say anything for a long time. And Nora, watching from the barn door, did not intrude on what was happening, because she understood that some things do not need witness or commentary. Marcus, the teenager who had posted the video, had come with his mother to the rescue facility the previous month to help with a volunteer workday, painting fences, mucking stalls, moving hay bales. He had not made a big thing of the part he had played. He had just worked, and at the end of the day he had stood for a while outside Dust's stall and looked at her, and she had looked back, and that had seemed like enough for both of them. Cleet Alderman never came to the facility. He never reached out. He did not, as far as anyone could tell, reflect publicly on what had happened in any meaningful way. He sold the ranch the following year and moved to a town in Nevada where nobody knew him. Whether he thought about the pony he had dragged through the mud while a crowd laughed, no one could say. That was his to carry. Dust, who Sadie quietly and privately began calling Penny again, just in her own mind, just in the way she said it when she stood at the paddock fence on her visits, did not run that spring. Her joints would never fully allow the kind of movement that a younger, healthier animal carries as a birthright. She would always have mornings where the cold made her slow to start. She would always carry, in the architecture of her bones and the texture of her coat, and the way she sometimes flinched at a sound she did not recognize, the record of everything that had been done to her and everything that had been withheld. But she ate, she drank. She walked her paddock in the morning light. She let people put their hands on her neck. She did not fear what came next. That was enough. That was, in the end, everything. The crowd that had laughed at the livestock sale had gone home that Tuesday, and most of them had not thought much about what they had seen. But some of them, the ones who had been there long enough to watch Nora walk across the mud and the pony stand back up and the crowd fall silent, some of them thought about it later. Not every day, not even every month. But sometimes, when they drove past a field and saw a horse standing alone at the edge of it, they slowed down. They looked. They did not always stop, but they looked. And sometimes looking is the beginning of everything that changes next.